Good afternoon, and to you participating from the US, good morning. This seminar is the third in a series of 4 seminars this week where we, the Living History Forum, have the honor to have our special 27th of January guest of this year with us. Welcome, Professor Carol Rittner.
Thank you.
Professor Rittner is a distinguished historian of Holocaust and genocide studies, she has a keen interest also in the teaching of the history of the Holocaust. She's also the author of several books on themes related to this field. On this occasion, we also have the pleasure of being joined by Professor John K. Roth, also from the US. Your academic field, Professor Roth, is the philosophy of religion, and you're well known for your important contributions as a writer and editor on major Holocaust themes. A warm welcome to you, Professor Roth. Last but not least, the third participant in this conversation is Dr. Johanna Mannergren-Selimovic, Associate Professor of Peace and Development Research. Her research focuses in post-conflict processes, transitional justice, and memory in Bosnia-Herzegovina, among other places. On behalf of the Living History Forum, I would like to express our appreciation for this cooperation with the Swedish Institute for International Affairs. The topic of today's conversation is the history of the Holocaust and the use of history, and it will be moderated by Rouzbeh Parsi, head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Institute of International Affairs. We look forward to listening to all of you when you discuss how to safeguard the memory of the Holocaust and other major violations of human rights. What are the challenges and how can history of such mass atrocities be used and misused? The starting point for the conversation is the book that you, Professor Rittner and Professor Roth, published last year with the title Advancing Holocaust Studies. In this book, you ask some tough questions that you and many other researchers within the field of the Holocaust studies are confronted with, like, what's it for? But before handing over to Rouzbeh Parsi, I have the pleasure to introduce a very special guest who will make a short intervention now at the very beginning of this event, namely the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Ann Linde. Please, Minister Linde, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Professors Rittner and Roth, tomorrow we commemorate the 76th anniversary of the liberation of the extermination camp Auschwitz-Birkenau. And we pay tribute to the 6 million Jews, 500,000 Roma, and other victims who were murdered in the Holocaust. The passing of the last witness to the Holocaust puts a clear responsibility on all of us to document their testimonies, to educate the next generation, to support research of the Holocaust, to remember and never to forget. Very soon, there will be no one left to tell us what happened. This is both a moral and a legal obligation. It applies equally to all genocide of mass atrocities, like the ones in Rwanda, and Srebrenica. This is why a Swedish state museum for passing on the testimony of those Holocaust survivors who sought refuge in Sweden will be established next year in Stockholm. This was announced today by Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, together with the Minister for Culture Amanda Lind and the Minister of Education Anna Ekström. This is also why the 50 heads of states and government and 20 organizations have been invited by Prime Minister Löfven to the Malmö Forum on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Antisemitism, 13 and 14 of October 2021. And thirdly, this is the reason why Sweden will be sharing the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2022 to 23. 20 plus years after the first Stockholm Forum on the Holocaust, on the Stockholm Declaration, building on our work 2 decades ago. Let me quote my Prime Minister. I have promised survivors to do what I can as Prime Minister and as a human being for Holocaust remembrance and combating antisemitism today. I intend to keep that promise. The presidency of the IHRA, the Malmö Forum, and the coming museum about Sweden and the Holocaust are all important parts of these efforts. End of the quote. Dear participants, even though history has shown us what the ultimate consequences of antisemitism, anti-Ziganism, and racism can be, they still exist in all parts of society. Sweden must set an example and to do all it can to prevent something similar to happen again. Let me be clear. Antisemitism and all forms of racism are threats to us all, not only to the Jews, and to our open and democratic societies. Wherever we see antisemitism, and no matter who express it, we must step in and with unwavering resoluteness, expose, confront, and combat it. We must also address Holocaust denial and antisemitism by protecting and promoting democratic values and respect for human rights. We cannot be complacent and fail to act when we see anti-Semitic acts or hate speech targeting Jews. In a few days, I will, as chairperson in office of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, host an expert meeting on combating anti-Semitism in the OSCE region. The OSCE holds the view that anti-Semitism poses a threat to stability and security in the OSCE region. The 57 participating states have committed themselves to work together to combat anti-Semitism throughout the region. Still, we have witnessed a spike in hate crime incidents based on racism and xenophobia in 2019, according to the OSCE ODIHR's hate crime report. Out of 6,964 reported incidents, more than 1,700 targeted Jews. Dear participants, let me conclude by saying that the magnitude of the Holocaust must be forever seared in our collective memory. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust will always hold universal meaning. With a vanishing number of Holocaust survivors, we have seen attempts at revising history, attempts that come from many sides, from the extreme right to the far left. We have also seen denials or distortion of historical facts and attempts to reinterpretation. This must be countered with full force. Therefore, I'm happy to welcome to Sweden Professor Emeritus of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Carol Rittner, who has been extremely productive in showing the world what a few courageous Christian nuns did to save Jews during the Holocaust, and much more. I also want to welcome Professor of Philosophy of Religion, John K. Roth. Finally, I would like to thank the Forum for Living History, Ingrid Långfors and Eva Frid, and the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, Rouzbeh Parsi, for organizing this timely panel discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Very much. Now we can start the conversation to try and disentangle some of these issues that have been mentioned. And I'll give the floor first to Carol to give us a rundown of the book, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mrs. Linda. I am in awe of everything that Sweden is doing and has done these past years. So thank you very much. And I think that your presentation sets us up very well for the discussion that we want to have. And I'm going to speak basically about the book that John Roth and I have edited. I'll speak about it in rather general terms, but let me begin by asking some questions. Have you ever asked yourself why you do what you do? Have you ever asked yourself what your work is for, what its meaning and significance is, whether what you do accomplishes anything? Well, in the spring of 2019, John Roth and I gathered 13 Holocaust scholar teachers, and that included ourselves plus 11 others, to explore such questions. What we wanted to get at was their individual and collective response to the questions: what is Holocaust studies for? What purposes govern the work that we all do? Are our efforts fundamentally ethical or not? The result is our book, Advancing Holocaust Studies, recently published by Routledge Publishing in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Now you might say, what an irrelevant set of questions. Holocaust studies is alive and well. Scholars research and teach about the Holocaust. European countries and a number of American states require study of the Holocaust. Students at all levels, from middle school through high school and into undergraduate and graduate school, study and learn about the Holocaust. Holocaust museums have been built. In fact, one is going to be built in Sweden. Monuments have been erected. Conferences and commemorations have been held for years. Isn't this evidence that Holocaust studies has had an enormous impact, not just on the worldwide Jewish community, but on all of us? Students are learning, communities are commemorating, and individuals, institutions, and even governments have made and are making huge financial investments to support the study, remembrance, and commemoration of the Holocaust. Doesn't all this prove how successful remembering the Holocaust is for the future? Well, now that's a good question. I would say that it is not at all clear that remembering the Holocaust, studying about the Holocaust, our historical memory of the Holocaust has been all that effective. Consider this. For the past 75 years, the growing discipline of Holocaust studies has inhabited a world racked by anti-Semitism, immigration and refugee crises, human rights abuses, mass atrocity crimes, threats of nuclear war, currently the COVID-19 pandemic, and environmental degradation, not to mention the January 6th, 2021 storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., the heart of American democracy. Some assumptions hold that learning and teaching about the Holocaust would curb, if not eliminate, such upheavals. Really? It's not easy to be optimistic about post-Holocaust humanity. which means that confidence about the outcomes of Holocaust studies and education bears watching. Our book, Advancing Holocaust Studies, has a very interesting and informative chronology of events, positive and negative, that contextualizes the development of Holocaust studies amidst many of the events of the last 75, 76 years since the end of World War II and the Holocaust. What have learning and teaching about the Holocaust been for in these currently dire straits? How has Holocaust studies and education helped us to navigate them? Can it even do so? Have we weighted the historical memory of the Holocaust with too many expectations? What does our work as Holocaust studies scholars and teachers mean in a world where leaders so often lie with impunity and governed by corruption and chaos? What is all this study of the Holocaust for? That is what we have tried to explore in this book that we published, Advancing Holocaust Studies. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I'm sure you remember him, argued that we must deal effectively, penitently with our past, or it will return to haunt us. When it comes to Holocaust memory, and the Holocaust is part of our historical memory, it is not at all clear that we have done so, nor is it clear what we should remember or how we should remember it. Read Advancing Holocaust Studies, and you will gain some great insights into what motivates 13 scholar teachers to do what they do. And our group consisted of women and men from the US and Canada, historians and philosophers, literary scholars, and eclectic scholars, teachers like myself. The Holocaust relevance is sustained because its relevance is primarily ethical, although not ethical in the ways that we earlier assumed. It is not clear, for example, that Holocaust education is the antidote, at least not a sufficient antidote, for anti-Semitism, although it is still essential in the battle against that scourge. Nor is it at all certain that Holocaust education can do much to eliminate genocide and crimes against humanity, although we would despair of that hope at our peril. In spite of skepticism about some of the optimistic assumptions that once energized Holocaust education, the Holocaust remains a powerful source of and context for deep, life-changing reflection about what Elie Wiesel called the right questions. What is good? What is right? What is most important? Of course, these questions are raised in many ways and out of many circumstances, but their situation in and emergence from the study of the Holocaust, from this historical memory, gives them capacities to move people that are unlikely to be surpassed, and textures supporting Wiesel's insistence that indifference and resignation are not the answer to them. Holocaust education, especially in the 21st century, takes place at memory's edge. That edge is at the border between honest loss of memory and forgetting on the one hand, and the distortion, falsification, and even denial of memory on the other. Memory's edge must be kept sharp, clear, keen, alert, and true, so that among other things, the pursuit of the right questions restrains and rectifies the failures of ethics. To teach about the Holocaust and to learn from it, this is the ethical calling of Holocaust education and the responsibility it confers not just this time, but every time. Presently, the Holocaust and study about it are deeply embedded in human memory, memorialization, scholarship, and teaching. Our book, Advancing Holocaust Studies, combines theory and practice. It also provides glimpses into the influences that have affected our varied approaches to researching, writing, and teaching about the Holocaust. And it even contains some of our insights about that genocide in ways that make this book more than the sum of its parts. The chapters show not only why their authors do not quit, but also why they persist in the conviction that efforts to advance Holocaust studies, done responsibly and well, can help people justify honestly, compassionately, ethically, human existence in a threatened post-Holocaust world.
Thank you very much, Carol, for a wonderful introduction, both to the book, but also to the subject matter as such, which is obviously universal in many ways. I'm going to give the floor now to John to carry the torch.
Now, can you hear me now? Great. I want to go back to some of the comments that Mrs. Linda made at the outset. I remember very well being in Stockholm 20 years ago for the wonderful meeting that led to the Stockholm Declaration, which was an important moment. And one of the things that Carol and I note in the chronology in our book that lists all the major events that need to note in the chronology about the development of Holocaust studies and education. And I'm so delighted to learn that a museum will open soon in Sweden to pay tribute to the Jews who found refuge in Sweden during and after the Holocaust. That place will change lives as people go through the museum and read and learn. These are themes we'll come back to, I'm sure, because they all have to do with memory. And I want to direct some of my comments to the importance of memory and our humanity. So I'm going to go back a little earlier in a sense, or a little more foundational kind of way than Carol Rittner's comments went. And to do that, I want to call to your attention a statement that Elie Wiesel once made. He said at one point that if we stop remembering, we stop being. It's a very simple but quite profound statement. If we stop remembering, we stop being. Now, he had 2 points in mind, I think, when he said that. One is a broad philosophical point that is very important, which is that memory is essential to our existence as human beings. If you take memory away, we stop existing as persons. It's one of the reasons why people so much fear dementia, the loss of memory as aging takes place, because it robs us of our identity. It robs us of our very existence. But Wiesel also meant this statement, if we stop remembering, we stop being. He meant it as a warning. That is, if we stop remembering what has happened, we endanger our existence. And in particular, he had in mind, I think, when he said, if we stop remembering, we stop being, the importance of remembering the Holocaust. And in doing that, to focus on what had happened, to memorialize what had taken place in places like Auschwitz and in the killing fields of Eastern Europe. But also, I think Wiesel had in mind other genocides, other mass atrocities, that if we stop remembering these things, we endanger our existence. Now, another point I want to make about memory in general here is that memory is not purely or simply good. It can be a source of immense harm and evil. If you think about it, anti-Semitism and racism and hate are impossible without memory. If you just erased memory, anti-Semitism, I don't think would exist. Hate would be gone. And these things thrive because people remember, or they imagine things that they remember, and they affect behavior. So memory was a condition for the Holocaust and other mass atrocities. If you took away, for example, the memory of World War I, as if that event had never happened, it's not at all clear that there would have been a Holocaust. So memory is important to our existence. We forget at our peril, but we need to be alert that memory is also part of the problem that we have as human beings. Because the things we remember or think we remember, and we have to understand also that memory is fallible, it can be mistaken, it can be biased, it can be distorting. So memory is something that we have to watch and be careful of, and we have to care for it. And this leads to the last point that I'll make that perhaps we'll want to come back to, or I will want to come back to in more detail as our conversation goes on. I think that there has to be what I like to call an ethics of memory. We have to think about what is required to keep memory good, to keep it, as Carol said in her comments at the beginning, to keep it keen, accurate, free of distortion. We have to try to ensure that memory has good health, which means that it respects and protects the facts, and it honors the past, and it thinks about the future in a way that recognizes that if we stop remembering well, we will endanger and maybe even, as Wiesel put it, stop being. So the act of remembering is an ethical act, and part of the ethical act of remembering is to reflect back on what we need and want memory to be and to do, and at the same time, what we want it not to be and to do.
Thank you, John. That's an excellent addition to our many-layered conversation on what it is that we're trying to achieve and how memory plays into that. Johanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will be very brief in these opening remarks. I have been listening with great interest to both Dr. Rittner and Professor Roth, and I think that the question of what's it for, as you said, Dr. Rittner, I think that's something that I can see the answer to every day in my studies, which is peace and conflict studies, especially focusing on transitional justice, reconciliation processes. Because I think the kind of conflicts that I look at that have happened more recently, we can be so helped by the insights from Holocaust studies when studying these conflicts. And I think one of the main insights, because Holocaust studies have this very long perspective by now, we can see that this kind of how can I say, maybe desire that is in my field of transitional justice to draw a line between war and peace. And we want that line to be very clear. And we want to put the memory of the atrocities to rest somehow, to put history to rest. And I think what you show and what Holocaust studies has shown is that it's not history, it's not memory, is not put at rest. Memory is restless. And I think this is a really important point to take for my field, that we need to be vigilant, we need to keep studying, and we need to understand the changes over time, over the decades of memory, when to remember, when to forget, who remembers and who forgets, and what does that mean for the situation for the people who in the societies that I studied, like Bosnia, Rwanda, and also recently Syria. How does that affect the everyday life of the people who actually live next to each other today? How do they deal with that memory? And I think that Holocaust studies do have not only factual knowledge, but also moral knowledge that I think we as peace and conflict researchers need to listen to. And I hope that we can discuss maybe a few of these topics in this continuing discussion. So with that, I pass the word back to Rouzbeh. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, let me not throw a spanner into the wheel, but let me, I mean, here you're talking about reconciliation, we're talking about memory. But isn't it also the question of reconciling with whom and about what? Because reconciliation in Bosnia and Herzegovina or Rwanda are between groups of people where there are perpetrators and victims. Not always easy to delineate, but they are in a sense coming from groups that they identify with or claim that they speak for. While in the case of the Holocaust, there is no reconciliation to be had in that sense. You may have reconciliation with history, you may have reconciliation with the trauma, but there are not different groups that need to reconcile. Would that be a fair distinction to make? Who wants to tell me I'm wrong?
I'm not sure I agree that when it comes to the Holocaust, there aren't groups that are aiming at reconciliation. I mean, all of the Jewish Christian, whether it's Jewish Roman Catholic Christian or Jewish Protestant Christian Orthodox Christian dialogue, much of it has been aimed at trying to come to some sort of reconciliation about what happened 70, 80, 85 years ago, 90 years ago in Nazi Germany, and of course during the Holocaust. And I think what inhibits the reconciliation is the enormous failures of the Christian churches, all of them, of every, and so I do think there are efforts being made at reconciliation. I mean, Vatican Council II in the Roman Catholic Church and the document Nostra Aetate, which of course, if you read it today, I mean, I read it, I reread it from time to time, it seems like, oh my gosh, we didn't go very far. And yet, in terms of how the Roman Catholic Church officially at the highest levels thinks about and tries to relate to the various Jewish communities, the Jewish people worldwide, it was an enormous change from attitudes of centuries. So I do think that among and between Christians and the various Jewish communities, there have been great efforts made about how do we come to some sort of reconciliation. And for me, the big question that is a big roadblock is the issue of forgiveness. That, you know, and that's an issue I think in other genocides as well. I mean, how do those women in Rwanda or former Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, who often live next door or in the same neighborhoods with their perpetrators. How do they deal with this issue of forgiveness? This is not an easy question at all.
John, you have to unmute yourself.
I want to go back to something that was said a moment ago, which I think I heard correctly, that memory is restless. I think it's a very rich concept. And so it can lead us in a variety of directions. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is, or one of the directions is that much of our attention in Holocaust and genocide studies, where we emphasize the ethical, is focused on trying to correct or to prevent things. We want to stop anti-Semitism. We want to stop hatred. We want to prevent further mass atrocities. And we think that education can be helpful in that regard. And I think to some extent it is, but as Carol Rittner pointed out, it isn't an antidote or a vaccine. But the other interesting direction that things may go, or at least the question has to be raised, is to what extent is memory of mass atrocities helpful in reconciliation, in helping people to get along with one another, or even at the more basic level, just to stop them from doing harm to one another. And I think that there can be impulses that arise through education about Holocaust and other genocide, mass atrocities, that stimulates a humanitarian impulse. I've seen this happen sometimes with my own students, that one of the things that some of them are led to want to do is to look for ways in which they can make an intervention of a humanitarian kind that has some healing qualities about it. And maybe that's an element that many of us who work in Holocaust and genocide studies have not emphasized enough. So I like the point about the restlessness of memory and how it can perhaps direct our attention in some ways more than it often does to the humanitarian impulses.
Johanna.
Well, just to connect back to your question, Rouzbeh, about reconciliation, I think it's really important to not imagine reconciliation as something that is a sort of deal made between different groups. I think reconciliation comes after justice, after truth. And that's the way you need to think about it. And it does not have very much to do with forgiveness, I think. I think forgiveness, it's a different realm, and maybe something that we should talk more about when it comes to personal and private relations. And it's a very kind, for me, I find when we start talking about forgiveness as part of a sort of collective realm of society, it can become very problematic. And I think that we've seen it in many societies emerging from mass atrocity, that those with less power are often sort of pushed into these process of sort of forgiveness and so on. So I think that's very important. But when it comes to memory and reconciliation, I think there is something to be said about remembering, and that there is something also to be said about forgetting, just as Professor Roth was also talking about. And I think when we as researchers try to understand this, I think the Holocaust is a very interesting point to look at, because we can see how over generations, the sort of remembering and forgetting is also changing with time. And so I think we need to add time to our analysis. And I think for me now, as the years go on, and I've been following Bosnia for a long time now, since the war, and that's already more than 25 years now, And you can see now that there are generations that the young adults in Bosnia today, they have no memory of the war themselves. And so how do we then talk about memory for this generation? So these are new questions for us who have studied the sort of genocides of the 1990s. And I think we can learn a lot from you.
Carol.
Yeah. I agree and disagree with you, Johanna, about this issue of forgiveness. I mean, one of the repeated comments that I have heard survivors of the Holocaust, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, make is never forgive and never forget. And so I'm not so sure that it's only at a personal level. I agree about justice and accountability and all the rest of it. But even this issue of today in Bosnia-Herzegovina, there are young people who have no memory of the genocidal events that happened there, of the genocide that happened there. And yet there are attitudes and comments that are probably passed on in families, in communities, stereotypes about the other, so I wouldn't dismiss this issue of forgiveness as well. It's between individuals. I mean, I think it's larger than that, although I completely agree with you that it comes after justice and.
Okay, but I think this is a very interesting, because it also segues into the other aspect. I mean, we're talking about utility to some degree. We're talking about what is the purpose, what is the use of studying or remembering and passing it on, because with time, whatever formative experiences or traumas people have, they erode. They erode to some degree, maybe with the individual, but they erode within the collective consciousness. I mean, that's the whole point of trying to keep memory, is because we know that if we don't actively do it, it will eventually wither away. I mean, that's the fate of everything over time. But this is then what brings us to that other aspect, which is institutions. Because we're not just trying to remember as individuals, we're not trying to just pass the family memory on, so to speak. We're also trying to create an institutional way that is not actually based or dependent on individuals, to be able to collectively pass this memory, whatever it is, on to the next one. And well, how do we do that? And more importantly, perhaps, how well does it work or doesn't? Because when one reads the book, it does contain a certain amount of lamentation over the fact that no matter how much education there is and so on, it doesn't necessarily act as a kind of inoculation.
Right.
Who wants to pick that up?
Well, I'll start. I think the institutionalization of memory is one of the safeguards against the inevitable erosion of memory that takes place with the passage of time. I have spent quite a bit of time studying the writings of a Holocaust survivor, januari, who notes at one point that what will be tomorrow, he says, is more valuable than what was yesterday. And so he's kind of lamenting and even resenting the passage of time that will unavoidably focus attention on the present and the future as the past, recedes further into the past. So one antidote to that is the institutionalization of memory, which takes place in countless ways. Teaching is a form of institutionalization. Establishment of museums, of libraries, of films, of gathering oral testimonies. All of these things are attempts to kind of beat back the inevitable passage of time that makes these events recede further and further away from us in our orientation toward the present and the future. So it's in a way it feels a bit like a losing struggle, and yet I think there's evidence, anecdotal, and maybe it's institutionalized to some extent now, that lives are changed individually and sometimes collectively by encounters with the institutional forms of memory. I think that it's important for us to be appropriately modest about our expectations in this regard. It is that we have to keep the work going. We have to keep the institutions healthy and supported. And as in the case upcoming in Sweden, we have to open new museums and new places. But we also have to be modest about how much can be accomplished by that work.
Johanna, can you reflect for us on how the events in the 1990s and even before that are being remembered, institutionalized in Bosnia-Herzegovina, or some of the efforts at that?
Yes, I think I just want to start by saying that something that you pointed out in your book, that the memory of the atrocities that happened started, the collection of that memory started already during the Holocaust. And this is, of course, through all the documents that the perpetrators left behind, all the evidence, so to speak, but also the narratives and so on that was collected by the victims. Mm-hmm. And I think that this collection, this archive that consists of many different things, exists in Bosnia, it exists in Rwanda, and now, as the war is still ongoing in Syria, it is being put together, the archive of evidence and facts and narratives. And I think this is the first thing when we think about, how do we then institutionalize that kind of archive? How do we define it? What do we display? What voices are we sort of made public? And I think when it comes to Bosnia, I think it's been a very fraught process of how to remember and how to do this. And I have many sort of bad examples, but I want to bring up a couple of good examples from Sarajevo, quite recent examples. And one is the museum, which is called the War Childhood Museum. I don't know if you've heard about it. Mm-hmm. It's a sort of crowdsourced museum through a guy who was a child himself during the siege of Sarajevo. And he asked sort of around on Facebook to his friends, what things make you think about the war? How do you remember your childhood during the siege? And his friends started to send him sort of stories about, my doll, my football, my tape recorder, and so on. And through a sort of several years process, he collected these things from his friends and from others. And they are now in the museum, a very nice, very sort of tip-top kind of modern museum in Sarajevo, where you go in and you see the display one after another of these toys or these sort of memories. And they are recounted, the stories from the who were children at that time, handed in the things. And they don't mention ethnicity, they don't mention, there are no sort of background descriptions that in the very polarized situation in Bosnia would, place them into different kind of camps. So you go in as a visitor and you have a very emotional and very direct experience of what it is to be a child in war. And I think that, to get back to Professor Roth, is a kind of also a way of connecting to that humanitarian kind of impulse. And so in that sense, I'm really hoping that this museum can be a site in Bosnia for that kind of very constructive remembering that gives sort of birth to empathy and understanding.
I'd like to just, I think it's a relevant comment here, a comment about the effects of historical memory. I was in Australia about, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, and I was invited to a Friday evening Shabbat dinner with friends, and there must have been 20 people there. And so everybody, the host and hostess had us go around and introduce ourselves. And this young woman, I'd say she was probably about 23, 24 years of age, introduced herself and said she was an Israeli. I think she was in the Israeli Air Force, but she was seconded to one of the Jewish communities in Melbourne that's to do work with young people. And she began to tell her story. She was the granddaughter of a Bosnian couple in Sarajevo who had hidden Jews during the Holocaust. Do you know this story that during the siege of Sarajevo, the Jews she helped, who were now in Israel, had emigrated to Israel after the war. They moved heaven and earth to try to get that Bosnian family that was left in Sarajevo out of former Yugoslavia, brought them to Israel, where they were living in peace. I was so struck by that, by the, if I could say, the good effects of memory, that Israeli Jewish couple remembered how their parents and perhaps grandparents had been saved in the 40s. They remembered, and they had a humanitarian impulse for sure. And they brought those survivors of that Bosnian family, a Muslim family, to Israel.
It's a fantastic story. John, please.
I want to go in a related but slightly different direction that I've been thinking about as the conversation has unfolded. And it goes back still again to this idea that Johanna introduced, the restlessness of memory. One of the things that I think is interesting is how events that happen now that are ongoing in our present can sometimes make us reflect and want to learn about the past. This has certainly happened in my own country, in the United States. We are in a period of time where lots of Americans are getting interested and learning, in some cases for the first time, about the history of racism in our country. And likewise, the current politics has aroused interest in anti-Semitism, and it has aroused interest in the developments that took place in Germany in the 1920s and the 1930s that are reflections of fear that Americans are facing now, that our democracy is very fragile and subject to being overturned if we aren't careful. So the present sometimes has a way of making us attentive to the past. It can improve our memories by taking us back into the history to see if there are insights, things that we need to recover and learn either for the first time or again about the background and the context for the things that we are living through right now. I'd be interested to know why in Sweden right now it seems important to open that new museum. There's always a question of, why now? Why is it now that that's going to happen in Sweden? Is there something in the current context that seems to create an urgency for that kind of development? And I think this is one of the places where this rich concept of the restlessness of memory comes into play, because there's an action and activity back and forth in terms of future, present, and past that is quite dynamic and can sometimes unfold in unexpected and even helpful kinds of ways.
Okay, that's a challenge. I'm not going to try and answer that immediately. I just want to first remind everyone, because I forgot to do that at the beginning, that if you want to ask questions, please post them in the chat and we'll try and address them in a little while. But I want to add something to this restlessness, which I think is a great turn of phrase that Johanna used. Because from a historical point of view, of course, history is never anything in and of itself. History is what you return to because you have an impulse. There's something you want to learn, or there is a lesson you want to draw for the present. It is the present that to some degree guides you into the history. And that means that each present, so to speak, elicits a different kind of memory and history. So when we're talking about the utility of why remember or how to remember, we're not just talking about what it can do for the future. We also have to think about what are we trying to preserve in and of itself. Are we trying to remember something for an individual person? Are we trying to remember something for a collective? That's one thing. But the other thing is, of course, what are we trying to draw in terms of lessons, like the ones you mentioned now, John? I mean, when people return to the 1920s to try and understand the 21st century, how much of the 1920s are they actually interested in? And to what extent is it an attempt to deal with the anxieties of the 21st century?
Mm.
Johanna, would you like to take up John on his challenge of explaining the museum now?
No, I don't think I'm the right person for that. I would rather prefer maybe Eva Frid to maybe say something about that, who understands the dynamics of museums and so on in Sweden. I mean, just on a very general note, I think it is an interest in history, and it's a sort of acknowledgement of history, and yeah, I'm not sure
I could
about
be
the dynamics.
I could be a bit sacrilegious, if you will, and just say that in general, history is not one of the most highly valued subjects if you look at the Swedish educational system. But one of the few things that most pupils are taught about is the Holocaust. So I mean, in that sense, the World War II and the Holocaust are one of the most important reference points. As historians, sometimes we complain that they don't learn more, but at least that much they do learn. But perhaps we could turn down to the third kind of, that we've already touched upon a bit, but that is how and to what extent there is a cross-pollination between the various fields of genocide studies, as in from Holocaust to the other more contemporary genocides. Johanna, perhaps could you tell us something from your vantage point to what extent that Holocaust studies has played a role or is seen as a reference point in how more recent genocides are studied? You're muted.
I was unmuted and I muted myself. Okay. So I think this is what I really began to say something about, that I think we can learn really a lot, but I think there has also been this kind of strange division, and I think this is completely the responsibility of the peace and conflict research field, that there hasn't been too many bridges back into Holocaust studies, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I think there is a kind of the whole field of transitional justice seems to be starting in the sort of end of Cold War and sort of looking at the sort of new wars and so on, and just there has been this kind of division. And I don't know, I mean, you are both scholars and teachers with a very long experience, and I really wonder, would you say the same in the States, that there is this kind of division between the research fields?
Well, I think there was a reluctance, and still is a certain kind of reluctance to get into comparative genocide studies. And I realize this is a rather superficial, generalized comment, but I do think that survivors of the Holocaust had an anxiety that somehow their suffering during and losses during the Nazi era, World War II, and the Holocaust would somehow be diminished if there was a comparison. So you had terms like the uniqueness of the Holocaust. There's never been anything like the Holocaust. Now, I think that people like, for example, Professor Yehuda Bauer, who has been one of the guests in the past, would no longer use terms like the uniqueness of the Holocaust. He would talk about the unprecedentedness of the Holocaust. And I think he would also say, because it happened once, it could happen again. Maybe not to the Jews, but to others. I do think that as the survivor generation is no longer with us, that attitudes about comparing and contrasting responsibly, of course, there will be less objection to that. And I also think that, well, let me just stop there because I'm afraid I'll go off on a tangent. John, you might have something to say.
I think that the enlargement of the study of mass atrocity crimes and genocides has done two things that are really important. One is to make us aware of how extensive in human history the genocidal impulses have been. That is the idea that, and memory is part of this, the idea that some group is singled out somewhere as so undesirable that we would be, quote, better off without them, and action follows in that way. So one of the things that has happened is that our horizons about the widespread character of genocide as a phenomenon have broadened. That's part of memory now, I think, for people who are alert and keen. That genocide is a relatively frequent and widespread phenomenon in human behavior, which raises all sorts of questions about, who are we as individuals and as members of groups and tribes and things of that kind. And what, if anything, can be done to curb the impulses that turn genocidal. And then I think the other thing that has happened that has been good, and it affects memory also, is that as the study of genocides has broadened out, it leads us to focus on the particularity of each one. Mrs. Linda mentioned in her opening remarks that the magnitude of the Holocaust is one of the things that is part of its particularity, vastness of it. I think this is one of the things that provides an impulse for wanting to study it and learn about it, that it was so huge and so vast. But every instance of genocide has its own particularity, and there is something to be learned and something to be discerned by looking at each one. The overall problem with genocide studies as a phenomenon is that there are so many of them that as a scholar I have found, it's almost impossible to get your head around the phenomenon. And that in itself is a factor in memory that it has to be reckoned with. The widespread nature of the mass atrocities of which genocide is a primary one.
If I may just add, in a sense, what Carol and John, what you were referring to, you can look also at the German discussion, the fight, the Historikerstreit, between different camps trying to reinterpret German history, in that this is so unique that it cannot be compared, and it puts Germany in a totally different category in terms of historical development, which is, from a kind of a scholarly point of view, I think unsustainable in the long run, because it means that you deny yourselves methods and instruments to understand what happened, because you can't have anything to grasp it with. But that in turn also means that when we are looking at mass atrocities and genocides, we are perhaps also getting to a point where we are starting to acknowledge that they are not also unique in the sense of being a kind of violence that is so unprecedented. Rather, they belong to a spectrum of violence, where it can go up and down, it can escalate and it can diminish, but it is not so far out, to put it in mundane words, that it cannot happen again, because obviously it has happened again.
Right.
And that process is possible to analyze, it's possible to follow, and it is partly possible to predict, which is also the reason why we have the Convention Against Genocide, etc. We have these instruments where we are supposed to be able to use before they happen, rather than just to find perpetrators afterwards, when it's, in a sense, too late. Johanna, did you want to say something?
Yes, just a short note on this question of comparison, which of course has been a topic and a theme, a contentious theme for so long. And I feel that comparison is not a very fruitful path to take. By that, I don't mean that we shouldn't, because I think it can lead to sort of relativization, and it will always be not enough. We will not be able to say that there is something that you can compare, but we can put different events and so on in dialogue with each other, and we can contrast them. And most importantly, we can ask the same questions to the particular instances of genocide or mass atrocities. And those questions, I think, can be the same. We can ask questions about gender, as Dr. Rittner, you had this conversation yesterday, I think.
Right.
Or we can ask questions about revisionism and denialism, and we can get answers that come out from the various mass atrocities that will enhance our knowledge when we then turn back and look at the particularities of each and every one of those.
Very good. We have a couple of minutes left, so let's quickly get to the few questions that we've gotten in now. One question is there a need to protect the memory from being purely instrumental? Because we've been discussing the utility, but the memory for the sake of memory itself, is there a need for that? Carol?
I think I will punt this to my two colleagues. I have to think a bit more about this.
Well, I think there's a place for memory as an end in itself, which is simply in the memorialization dimension of memory. Let me give an example that will lead back to Sweden in an interesting way. I'm very interested in the writings of a French woman. She was not Jewish, but she was deported to Auschwitz. Her name was Charlotte Delbo. Mm-hmm. Charlotte Delbo wrote an amazing trilogy that she called Auschwitz and After. And she was a person who found refuge in Sweden at the end of the war and was kind of, rehabilitated in Sweden before she found her way back to her native France. And one of the things that she emphasizes in her book is the importance of actually seeing the dead. Not turning the dead in mass atrocities or genocides into statistics, into numbers that, there were 6 million or whatever, 800,000 killed in Rwanda in 90 days, but actually trying to see the individual, to see that the person who was slaughtered, abused, even their corpse abused, was once a living person who had parents and brothers and sisters and perhaps children and, you know, lovers and things of this kind. And I think that memory has a role to play as an end in itself without being instrumentalized in simply, you know, honoring the persons, honoring the past in that way. And maybe even doing something that too infrequently happens, I think, in teaching and scholarship about these atrocities, finding a place for grief and sorrow. I think this is, these things are important when we think about the qualities of memory that deserve respect.
Thank you. Johanna, would you like to say something on this? Otherwise, I have 2 more questions. Good. Then very quickly, I mean, John, you mentioned memory as a negative force as well. How can we pay attention to that? And perhaps that is also particularly relevant when we are discussing reconciliation.
Well, I think we have to think about how we create good memory. Good memory, not in the sense that we can ever deny that what we're remembering when we think about these mass atrocities, that the content of memory isn't good. And good memory isn't just about facts and figures and, you know, the details and everything, but good memory, I think, is something that keeps our attention focused on some of the questions that Carol mentioned. That is, what is most valuable? What's most important? What is good? What is just? Go back to the theme that Johanna mentioned. It seems to me that memory is healthy to the extent that it is questioning, that it's restless in the sense that it questions itself, and it leads us to reflect on what is good and right and true.
No, I think that the theme, if I'm not mistaken, for the commemoration in Stockholm is the courage to care, which is really the title of a book and a film that I had a hand in. And I agree, we have to remember good memories and remember them appropriately. I think we also have to be careful that, particularly when it comes to the Holocaust, that we have to remember, if I can put it in a cliche, there are no heroes without villains. And we have to look at both the memory, if I could say, of the villains and of what happened to the victims of the Nazis, both Jewish and non-Jewish, as well as look to those who tried to help. But we can't unbalance it. We can't just have good memories that we pass on about the Holocaust.
Thank you. Johanna, would you like to add something?
Just one very short sentence, and that's that courage to care sometimes does not come in the form of speech and words and a sort of verbal remembering, but it can also come in the form of silence. And I've been doing some research on silence, which I find very fascinating, and just to sort of throw it out there that silence can also be restorative.
Very interesting. Okay, I think at this point we are going to have to close down. Thank you very much for a very interesting and illuminating conversation. We could go on for hours, obviously, because there are so many things in this. There's a depth to this, an existential depth. This is not just a question of history writing and so on. This is really about the core of what it means to be human. And for this conversation, I thank all 3 of you, and I hope that we will be able to continue it somewhere else in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.